Nicole Kidman has made her first public appearance since her split from Keith Urban.
She stayed silent for nearly 2 decades. Through the rehab stays, the long separations, the whispered rumors, and the carefully managed red carpet smiles, Nicole Kidman said nothing. She protected him, defended him, and stood beside him when most people would have walked away. But now the marriage is over, the legal documents are signed, and for the first time, the woman who held everything together is letting the truth breathe. Not through a tearful interview or a social media post, but through her actions, her silence, and the story that is quietly unfolding in the spaces between what was said and what was endured. What is emerging is not a story of a bitter split. It is something far more profound. It is the story of a woman who gave everything and finally decided that was enough. For nearly 20 years, Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban represented something rare in the entertainment world, a love story that actually seemed to be working. In an industry where marriages dissolve faster than they form, they were held up as living proof that genuine partnership could survive fame, distance, addiction, and the relentless pressure of public life. Magazines featured them on covers. Talk show hosts praised their chemistry. Fans across the globe invested emotionally in their relationship the way people invest in a favorite film, wanting the ending to be happy, needing it to be real. And on the surface, there was plenty to believe in. Keith would choke up at award ceremonies thanking Nicole, his voice cracking with what appeared to be genuine gratitude. She would light up in interviews when his name was mentioned, describing him as the person who had brought her back to life after the pain of her first marriage. Their daughters, Sunday Rose and Faith Margaret, were shielded carefully from the media circus, a deliberate choice that spoke to how seriously both parents took the idea of a protected, stable family life. Everything about the image they presented suggested two people deeply committed not just to each other, but to the life they had built together. But images, no matter how beautifully constructed, are not the same as truth. And what is now becoming clear is that the picture Nicole and Keith presented to the world required enormous, daily effort to maintain, effort that, over time, became unsustainable. To understand what Nicole ultimately exposed through her decision to file for divorce, you have to understand what she walked into this marriage carrying. Her first marriage, to Tom Cruise, had ended in ways that left scars that never fully healed. The loss of day-to-day closeness with her adopted children, Isabella and Connor, was a wound she rarely spoke about publicly, but that those close to her described as one of the deepest griefs of her life. She had gone through that experience largely alone, composed in public while quietly devastated in private. When she met Keith Urban in 2005, she was a woman who had rebuilt herself with remarkable determination. She had won an Academy Award. She had reclaimed her career and her identity. But emotionally, she was still searching for the family she felt she had lost. Keith, with his warmth and vulnerability and his obvious need for someone steady, called to something in her that was both generous and, perhaps, a little wounded. She saw in him a chance to be the partner she had not been allowed to be before, the one who stays, who supports, who helps someone become their best self. What she may not have fully anticipated was how much of that role would fall entirely on her shoulders, and for how long. Just 4 months after their wedding in June 2006, Keith entered rehabilitation for alcohol dependency. The timing could not have been more painfully symbolic. She had barely begun her life as his wife before she was thrust into the role of his anchor. She chose loyalty. She visited him in treatment. She refused to let the tabloids see her waver. And when he emerged, she championed his recovery publicly and privately with a fierce protectiveness that spoke volumes about her character. For years after that, she remained the steady force in a partnership that needed one. His career took him on the road constantly. Her work required her presence on film sets around the world. They made rules for themselves, agreements about how long they would allow themselves to be apart, because without structure, the distance might swallow them whole. She was the one who built and maintained that structure. She was the one who created the framework within which their family functioned. This is not a small thing. It is exhausting work. And it is the kind of work that, when done invisibly and without acknowledgement, eventually takes an enormous toll. None of this is an attack on Keith Urban as a person or as an artist. By all accounts, he is genuinely talented, genuinely warm, and genuinely loved by the people in his life. His battle with addiction is not a character flaw, it is an illness, and he has spoken about it with honesty and courage over the years. But addiction, even when being managed, casts a long shadow over the people closest to the person living with it. For Nicole, that shadow never fully lifted. Even during the years when Keith appeared to be doing well, sources close to the couple indicated that she never fully relaxed into the security she craved. There was always a part of her that was watching, monitoring, quietly bracing for a shift. And while that vigilance came from a place of love, it also meant she was never entirely a partner in the relationship. She was always, to some degree, a caretaker. Keith himself apparently struggled with that dynamic. Reports over the years suggested that he sometimes felt diminished by the role Nicole's presence assigned him. The recovering addict, the one who needed saving. He reportedly wanted to be her equal, not her ongoing project. That tension between her need to protect and his need to be seen as whole and capable became one of the quiet fault lines running beneath their marriage. When two people are locked in a dynamic where one is always rescuing and the other is always being rescued, resentment tends to build on both sides. She resents the weight. He resents the implication. Neither is wrong, but the cycle is quietly corrosive, and over 19 years, it carved deep grooves into their foundation. Marriages rarely end in a single moment. The dramatic blow-up, the single devastating revelation, those make for compelling storytelling, but they are seldom the actual mechanism of a marriage's end. More often, it is the accumulation of smaller things, the repeated disappointments, the compromises that eventually feel like surrenders, the gradual recognition that the person you fell in love with and the life you are actually living have grown too far apart to reconcile. By the early 2020s, those who were close to Nicole and Keith were noticing changes. She began attending more public events on her own. He was photographed on tour without his wedding ring on multiple occasions. In interviews, their language about each other shifted, still warm, still respectful, but somehow less specific, less alive, as though they were speaking from memory rather than from present feeling. Nicole, for her part, began pouring herself even more deeply into her daughters and her craft. Friends described her as someone who had entered a period of profound self-reflection, quietly reassessing what she needed and what she was no longer willing to give up in order to maintain a relationship that was draining more than it was sustaining her. She stopped performing the marriage in the ways she once had, not out of cruelty, but out of an emotional exhaustion that had simply run its course. When she filed for divorce in late September 2025, citing irreconcilable differences, the legal language was minimal, but what it represented was enormous. This was a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades putting someone else's stability ahead of her own, and who had finally made the decision to stop. The divorce documents themselves told a quiet but significant story. Nicole filed in Davidson County, Tennessee, where the family maintained their home. She sought primary residential custody of Sunday and Faith, with Keith retaining joint decision-making authority. Notably, both parties waived spousal support and child support, an arrangement that suggested their finances had long been managed separately, and that neither was entering this process looking to punish the other financially. What that filing communicated, to anyone paying careful attention, was that Nicole had thought this through completely. This was not an impulsive decision made in the heat of conflict. It was a considered deliberate choice made by a woman who had spent months, possibly years, arriving at the conclusion that the marriage could no longer be what either of them needed it to be. She was not asking for war. She was asking for release. And in choosing to prioritize the stability of her daughters above everything else, she was also making a statement about the lessons she had learned from her own past. She had lost closeness with her first set of children in ways that still hurt her deeply. She was not going to allow that to happen again. Her girls would have a consistent home, a present mother, and a life built on predictability rather than the beautiful but exhausting chaos that had defined so much of her marriage. If Nicole's response to the end of her marriage was composed, measured, and inward, Keith Urban's was the opposite. Within days of the divorce announcement, he appeared at a concert in Pennsylvania on his world tour, and the performance became something far more revealing than a standard night of country music. He walked onto the stage without his wedding ring. That alone was noticed immediately. But what followed made it unmistakable that he was processing something raw and unresolved in the most public way imaginable. During a performance of one of his older songs, a track widely associated with the end of a relationship, he altered the lyrics in a way that struck many observers as a pointed commentary on the breakdown of his marriage. The change was small in words but enormous in implication, and it spread across social media within hours. He also dropped from his setlist a song widely believed to have been written with Nicole in mind, a deliberate erasure of their shared history from his stage performance that fans noticed immediately. Between songs, he spoke openly and emotionally about his past, his childhood, and the passion for music that had carried him long before fame entered his life. It was as though he was reaching back to a version of himself that existed before their marriage, reclaiming an identity that had perhaps become too tangled up in being Nicole Kidman's husband. His vulnerability, always one of his most endearing qualities, was fully on display. But what it also revealed, inadvertently, was the very dynamic Nicole had quietly walked away from. Here was a man processing the end of his marriage in public at full volume, in real time, while she chose silence, privacy, and the company of her daughters. The contrast could not have been more telling, and it said more about the 19 years they had spent together than any interview either of them had ever given. This is the part that people sometimes miss when they look for the exposure in a celebrity divorce. They expect press releases, tearful confessions, pointed interviews. But Nicole Kidman has never operated that way. Her form of revelation is far more subtle and, in many ways, far more powerful. By filing quietly and composedly, she exposed the exhaustion of a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades managing not just her own life, but the emotional infrastructure of someone else's. By seeking primary custody and refusing spousal support, she exposed a financial and familial independence that suggested she had been preparing for this moment for longer than anyone knew. By appearing at public events after the divorce announcement composed, clear-eyed, and without performance, she exposed the reality that she had already done her grieving, that the loss had been processed over years of quiet disappointment, not in the weeks since the filing. And by saying almost nothing, she let Keith's concert performances say everything. The contrast between her stillness and his public emotional unraveling was, in itself, a form of testimony. It showed who had been holding the relationship together. It showed the toll that holding had taken. And it showed what life looked like for each of them once that dynamic was released. At the center of everything, as has always been the case for Nicole, are her children. Sunday Rose and Faith Margaret are now teenagers, growing up in the public eye in ways that their mother has fought hard to control and moderate. The divorce filing's emphasis on their stability and their primary residence with Nicole was not simply a legal formality. It was a declaration of intent from a mother who has never forgotten what it felt like to be separated from the children she loved. Those who know Nicole will have said consistently that her daughters are the most important thing in her life, more important than any role, any award, any public image. Every major decision she makes passes through the filter of what is best for them. Her decision to end her marriage, painful as it clearly was ultimately shaped in part by the recognition that a household defined by tension, monitoring, and suppressed conflict was not the stable environment her girls deserved. Keith reportedly loves his daughters fiercely, and the custody arrangement, while difficult, reflects the practical realities of his touring lifestyle rather than any failure of affection. But Nicole made the choice that she has always made when it comes to her children. She chose presence over image, and reality over fairy tale. What Nicole Kidman has ultimately exposed in the aftermath of this divorce is something that goes beyond her specific marriage to Keith Urban. She has exposed the invisible labor that so many people, and disproportionately women, perform inside long-term relationships without recognition or acknowledgement. The constant emotional monitoring, The role of the anchor. The work of holding someone else steady while quietly neglecting your own need to be held. She stayed for 19 years. She gave everything she had to making it work. She was not a passive participant in the fairy tale. She was its architect, its maintenance crew, and its most devoted defender. And when she finally accepted that she could not sustain it any longer, she did not collapse, or rage, or seek revenge. She simply, quietly, chose herself. That is not a small thing. In fact, for a woman who spent so many years defining herself in relation to someone else's needs and struggles, it may be the most significant thing she has ever done. The cameras will move on. The tabloid cycle will find its next story. But what Nicole Kidman has demonstrated in the way she has handled the end of one of Hollywood's most iconic relationships is something quietly extraordinary. She has shown that self-respect, even when it comes late, even when it comes at great personal cost, is not a betrayal of love. It is, in the end, the most honest thing a person can offer to themselves and to the person they are leaving behind.